Happy Sabbath. So today we're going to have a history lesson about this cute little lady. Do any of you recognize her? Here she is as a young woman. And her name is Irena Sendler. And we're going to talk about some stuff she did when she was a young woman. Irena Sendler was a Polish Catholic woman. She was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1910. And her father was a doctor, and he was very hardworking and really sacrificed a lot for his patients. And she asked him as a little girl, "Why do you go to this trouble?" And he said, "Irena, we are bound. If we see someone who is drowning, we must extend them an arm, or at least a pinky. We have to do what we can to help someone." And she remembered that all her life. And in fact, her father did die young. He died of an infection he caught taking care of a patient during an epidemic. So she grew up and she went to college. And during that time in Poland, like in a lot of parts of Europe, there were very bad feelings towards Jewish people. They were hated. And even in the university, they were made to sit on a separate bench. They couldn't sit with the rest of the students. Irena thought that was just ridiculous. So one day she went and sat with her Jewish friends, and it made the university so mad they expelled her for 3 years. She eventually went back and finished her education and became a social worker. So this would have been in the early 30s. And the feelings toward Jewish people got worse. Not only were they made to sit on a separate bench, their apartments were taken away, they were all moved into a few blocks of the city. You might have heard the word called a ghetto. This was a secure area of just a few blocks where 40 or 50,000 people were made to live. Their possessions were taken away, and they were basically imprisoned there with their children, without enough food, without enough clothes, without enough fuel. And to make things worse, little by little, Nazi Germany, who was in charge in Poland at that time, was loading them onto trains and taking them away, never to be seen again. So you can imagine how scary this was for everybody, not to mention parents with children. Here comes Irena Sendler and her friends. They form a group called the Zagota. They were resisting the evil of the Nazi Germans, and they figured out a way to try to help the children in the ghetto. There was an outbreak of disease, and that was something that the Nazis did worry about. They didn't care too much what happened to the people in there, but they didn't want any nasty germs to get out. So Irena wasn't a nurse, but she put on a nurse's uniform and she marched in, and the Nazis let her in to screen for disease. She did this every day for almost 18 months, and she would go in pretending to bring medicine or maybe some food, but she would always sneak out with a child, which was highly illegal and very dangerous. And not only was it tricky to get the child out past the Nazi soldiers, it was tricky to convince their parents that this was a necessary thing to do, because Irena saw what was happening and she knew that those children would not survive. And it was a great courage on her part and on the part of the parents to relinquish those children one by one. And she would do it in any way she could. In a sack of potatoes, she'd hide a toddler. If she was taking a sick patient out in an ambulance, she would hide a child under the stretcher. One time she even had a carpenter bring out a baby in his toolbox to get those kids out. She was remarkable, and she had friends on the outside who would find safe houses for these children. She taught them how to pretend not to be Jewish. She taught them to speak perfect Polish. She taught them to say all the little Catholic prayers that Catholic children would know, so that if a soldier were to stop them, they could pretend to be Catholic and be left alone. She did this over and over to the point of rescuing 2,500 children. After the 2,500 children were rescued, she was arrested, and she was imprisoned, and she was tortured. Meanwhile, she had written down the names of all these children, their real names, their pretend new Catholic names, and their safe place, whether it be an orphanage or what family they were staying with. She would write it on little slips of tissue paper, roll them up, and bury them in a glass jar. Like this. There were jars with all the information linking children to their past buried under an apple tree in her yard. But now she's in prison and she's in trouble. And they tortured her. They broke both of her legs. They beat her so badly. But she would not tell who helped her. She would not tell where the children were. She would not tell who made the false documents that allowed them to get new identities. So she was sentenced to death by firing squad. But at the last minute, she thought she was being taken out to her death. Her friends in the resistance bribed the Nazi guard, and he pretended to execute her, but let her go out the back door. So she went into hiding, and after the war, when the communists took over, she was imprisoned and interrogated again, and was forced to join the Communist Party. And that Communist Party pretty much silenced all the resistance workers. How her story came to light, oh, and then by the way, between the time after she was free, she dug up the jars after the war and tried her best to reunite the children with their families. That wasn't very successful because most of the parents did, in fact, die in the war. But most of the ones that were in foster homes stayed with those new families. So in 1999, there's a high school in Kansas where the history teacher likes to bring history to life. And every year the children have to have a project where they act out some segment of history that maybe nobody had heard of. So one of the students came across a story about Irena Sendler in Newsweek. And it said, she rescued 2,500 children. And they said, no, that's got to be a typo. You know, maybe it was 250, not 2,500. So they started looking into it, and sure enough, she did. And they wrote a play about her. And then they started trying to see what ever became of her, and they found out she was still alive. So these students, with the help of a local businessman, raised money to go see Irena Sendler. She was in a nursing home in Poland. And this is how she looked at that time. Pretty sweet-looking lady, but she was a tough cookie. And what she said to them was, I am so delighted to see you. She said, I am not a hero. I just did what was the normal thing to do, and I had a lot of help doing it. But I am so glad to see you, and now that you know about my work, you can continue it. And I thought, what a great thing to say. That's what Jesus asks us to do. We know about his work, and it's up to us to continue it, and that's what the Bible tells us too. So this jar doesn't have names and addresses and secret identities. It has a Bible verse for you. And it smells a little like sauerkraut. 1 Peter 4:10, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. So if someone's drowning, even if you can't swim, you can give them your pinky. And that's your history lesson today.